Why did you click on this video? Maybe it was because you've heard of pragmatism before. Maybe you just like my drawing of young William James. Maybe you saw philosophy in the title and you wanted something to make you sound sophisticated for your next date. Either way, the philosophy of pragmatism isn't as famous in internet circles as other more personal philosophies. Therefore, in order to convince you to get through this long video with me, I'm going to make an elevator pitch for two groups of people, those that don't have some background in philosophy and those who do. Whether it be a student, a casual reader, or just someone who lurks around the internet. Here are the timestamps, so decide what group you belong to and head on there. Or you could just listen to both if you enjoy the soothing sound of my voice. Let's start with you guys who aren't super knowledgeable about philosophy, but are interested nonetheless in ideas that can improve your life. What pragmatism can offer is a method of dealing with issues that affect our lives. I mean, we're human, life's not perfect, and issues are gonna pop up for us. Now, sometimes the solutions to our problems are simple. If you don't like the way you look, work out, get a haircut, try a new style. However, many times there are issues in our lives with no clear answer. How should I live my life? Should I be religious? What goal should I be striving after for and why? Now, you'll certainly encounter other philosophies on the internet that will prescribe their own answers to these problems. But pragmatism is going to offer not so much an answer, but a method to help you yourself answer those questions. Another awesome thing about pragmatism is that you don't need any formal education. In many cases, actually, street smarts could be more valuable. The reason for this is that pragmatism is democratic and requires imagination. I sometimes apply pragmatism to my life by calling my friends and asking for their opinions on certain issues in my life, and getting their advice. Then I weigh what they say against my previous thoughts and see what happens. Pragmatism is extremely accessible in this way, and is great for those who don't necessarily have any background knowledge in philosophy, but do want to grapple with life's greatest questions. So hopefully now I'm speaking to those who have some sort of education in philosophy, whether it be schooling or self-taught. Let me know if this story sounds familiar. One day in your pretty routine life, you begin asking some pretty big questions. Maybe you're wondering the stereotypical "what's the point of life" question. Or maybe you have a big ethical problem on your hands, and you just want some answers. Either way, you think philosophy may have the answers for you and you dive in head first. Now, what I've noticed personally is that usually two scenarios appear. Scenario one is where you settle into a certain philosophy and make a nest there. Maybe you're a Stoic or an Epicurean or an absurdist. But even though you've set up camp in one of these philosophies, not everything about that philosophy fits you, you know? And furthermore, there are certain ideas in other philosophies that sound pretty appealing. So I guess you kinda just settle, just for convenience sake. The other, and seemingly much more common scenario too, is where you eventually end up in the realm of skepticism. I remember back in my undergrad studies, all roads seemed to lead back to skepticism. Maybe you get there through David Hume or Nietzsche, maybe the postmodernists, hell, even Eastern philosophy can get you there. That's kind of what happened in my case. Either way, the allure of skepticism is always there for many philosophy students. And this is just what I've personally witnessed, so let me know in the comments if you fell into one of these two categories, or if you're in another category itself. Either way, pragmatism, I believe, is able to address both scenarios and offer an alternative that you can consider. And with that, hopefully I have you both back here. We could begin by looking at what pragmatism is and what it's trying to address. First, some context. We already have 4 videos on pragmatism for your viewing pleasure. And while these all predate the lectures we have here today, you'll be fine if you just want to watch this. I also want to mention that we're covering 2 lectures out of 8 given in 1907, which is relevant because the first lecture deals with the dilemma in philosophy that was going on back then. For those without a philosophy background, this might not be relevant to you, so skip ahead. But for the rest of you hooligans, let's get into the first lecture. So James starts off by giving a shout out to philosophy, because you can't just offer a new philosophy without giving praise to the field itself. Let a controversy begin in a smoking room anywhere about free will or God's omniscience or good and evil, and see how everyone in the place pricks up his ears. Philosophy's results concern us all most vitally, and philosophy's queerest arguments tickle agreeably our sense of subtlety and ingenuity. So philosophy people, my friends, We're the type of people to stay up late at night in a dorm room, maybe drinking some tea or alcohol more likely, and really diving into an interesting question. Don't you just love that? And we almost never got to a clear answer in the end, but the discussion was always super fun. Hopefully you can relate. But shortly after praising philosophy, James says something that really pissed a lot of people off. The history of philosophy is to a great extent that of a certain clash of human temperaments. Now hold up, you may say. Reading philosophy can be super dry and impersonal. It's full of logic and reason, and there's no emotion involved. And yes, while it's true that philosophical texts have that impersonal nature, James believes this comes after the temperament. The temperament first decides the proposition, and then that proposition is defended using rationality or empiricism. Temperament is no conventionally recognized reason, so he urges impersonal reasons only for his conclusions. Yet his temperament really gives him a stronger bias than any of his more strictly objective premises. And I mean, think about this. Every philosopher I've read is intelligent, no doubt about that, and yet they often come to drastically different conclusions. Maybe temperament is the reason behind this. Now with this in mind, James recognizes two broad categories of temperaments found in philosophy. In one corner, we have the tender-minded philosopher, and in the other, the tough-minded philosopher. And look, James admits that these categories are somewhat arbitrary and largely generalizations, but they're useful for later. The picture I've given is indeed monstrously oversimplified and rude, but like all abstractions, it will prove to have its use. Also, just look at these categories yourself and see if you could tell which philosopher might fit into what group. Tender-minded philosophers are rationalistic, which James defines as focused on principles. They're also intellectualistic, idealistic, optimistic, religious, a believer in free will, monistic, and dogmatic. Think about which philosophers might fit into this category, and hey, maybe you yourself fit in here. Let me know. If, however, the tender-minded group does not sound appealing, there is also the tough-minded group. The tough-minded are empiricists, which James defines as going by facts, sensualistic, materialistic, pessimistic, irreligious, fatalistic, pluralistic, and skeptical. So this was the dilemma James saw in his time. These two generalized groups in philosophies with these large differences. Now again, these are somewhat arbitrary, and James recognizes that people are usually not one or the other, but a mix of the two. Most of us have a hankering for the good things on both sides of the line. Facts are good, of course. Give us lots of facts. Principles are good. Give us plenty of principles. Now James recognizes that there are certain negatives in each of these groups as it applies to what people want. He starts by criticizing the tough-minded person. Let him record truth, inhuman though it be, and submit to it. The romantic spontaneity and courage are gone. The vision is materialistic and depressing. This was also before existentialism really gained popularity, I should mention. And look, I could see people being these fact-focused materialists and still being happy. That's totally possible. But I've also personally met people who do have that nihilism about them when they only focus on the facts and the matter of the world. Regardless, that's what James sees as the problem with a tough-minded person. Now, the tender-minded person also receives a critique. The more absolutist philosophers dwell on so high a level of abstraction that they never even try to come down. We should have a philosophy that we could see, feel, and act upon in our lives. If we just have abstract ideas that can't connect well to reality, then someone might feel them to be redundant. So now that we've established the problem with these two groups, what is it that James believes people might actually want from philosophy? You want a system that will combine both things. The scientific loyalty to facts and willingness to take account of them, the spirit of adaptation and accommodation, in short, but also the old confidence in human values and the resultant spontaneity, whether of the religious or of the romantic type. This romantic type that he's referring to is super interesting to me. Spoiler alert, but I think about the Shawshank Redemption and the hope that Andy's character has, while Red tells him that his hope is bad for him. Red is right in a sense, definitely more in line with the reality of the situation, but that hope, that romantic ideal keeps Andy going and gets him to eventually escape. What romantic pursuits might you pursue in life that might be somewhat disconnected with the facts? Comment below. Now friends, that was the dilemma in 1907 for William James. Hopefully in my introduction, I highlighted a more modern dilemma that many students of philosophy face today. If either the past or current dilemmas appeal to you in some way, then follow me into the next section of the video where we finally get into what pragmatism means. So there are two parts to pragmatism that work together. There is the methodology of pragmatism and the theory of truth that pragmatism offers. Such then would be the scope of pragmatism. First, a method, and second, a genetic theory of what is meant by truth. Let's start with the method. Say you're trying to determine whether or not Patrick here is your friend. Now conventionally, you may try to define what a friend is in some abstract sense. Maybe go to the dictionary, then see if it applies to Patrick. Pragmatism, on the other hand, is going to ask you to look for the practical consequences. It's going to ask, assuming Patrick is your friend, what practically follows? And if Patrick isn't your friend, what practically would follow then? Asking these types of questions is what the pragmatic method is about. Here it is spelled out. The pragmatic method in such cases is trying to interpret each notion by tracing its respective practical consequences. What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion, rather than that notion, were true? If no practical difference can whatever be traced, then the alternatives mean practically the same thing, and all dispute is idle. So going back to our Patrick example, if you believing that Patrick is your friend means that you'll invite him to your poker games on Friday night, then that's what is practically meant by friend. It follows that if you don't believe Patrick is your friend, then you won't invite him to the poker games. Obviously, that's an oversimplification of practically defining friend, but the point here is that we're trying to focus on consequences. See, this is where imagination comes into play for pragmatism. You're predicting what effect believing an idea to be true will have on you. But what if there is no real practical difference? Say you take a bite out of an apple and see that the white part is inside. Your friend gives you the proposition that, hey, that part is white because there's an apple fairy that waves their wand and makes all the apples white on the inside. And your other friend is like, no, it's white because insert scientific explanation that I'm not very knowledgeable about here. Now these two are drastically different hypotheses. However, if the only practical effect we notice is that the inside of the apple is white, then there's no actual practical difference between these two hypotheses. So then who cares? Moving on. I want to eat my apple already. If, however, you could find some practical difference, like maybe you believe that fairy magic makes you stronger, and therefore you eat more apples as a result, then we could say that there's a meaningful practical difference here worth talking about. And as mentioned in our Peirce episode, where he's more interested in the sciences, James, in contrast, is much more focused on how these ideas actually influence our lives. The whole function of philosophy ought to be to find out what definite difference it will make to you and me, at definite instants of our life, if this world formula or that world formula be the true one. So for our apple example, believing in the fairy would cause you to eat more apples, which is an actual difference being made in your life. But we see so many arguments, especially on the internet, that go on, and yet they're over stuff that don't really have a practical consequence on your life. For example, I saw some people arguing over the reasons behind height differences across countries. Height differences. How does discovering the origins of height differences practically affect our lives? I mean, maybe it applies to you, I don't know, but it just wasn't important to me. So in that case, pragmatism is a bit of a time saver. Ask yourself, is the idea being discussed going to have a practical and meaningful difference to me in my life? Boom. 90% of internet arguments can now be ignored, and you could use that time instead to live life. Now, since we're looking at practical effects of ideas and how they might affect our lives, we can't know for certain how an idea will play out for us. I mean, unless you go to Hogwarts, you probably can't tell the future. Therefore, ideas are not so much endpoint solutions, but rather experiments that you could test out. You must bring out of each word its practical cash value. Set it at work within the stream of your experience. It appears less as a solution, then, than as a program for more work, and more particularly as an indication of the ways in which existing realities may be changed. Theories thus become instruments, not answers to enigmas, in which we could rest. Pragmatism unstiffens all our theories, limbers them up, and sets each one at work. And that essentially is the pragmatic method, a focus on the practical, meaningful consequences of ideas, instead of trying to abstractly define ideas separate from how they actually play out in the real world. To sum it up, the attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, facts. Now that may be all fine and dandy, but that fairy example kinda rubbed you the wrong way, didn't it? I mean, on the surface, doesn't the pragmatic method seem to endorse believing in this apple fairy if it practically gets you to eat more apples? Doesn't that seem a little anti-truth? Well, thankfully, we're about to dive into James's pragmatic theory of truth and see how the apple fairy example is going to be put in check. Now, we start by acknowledging a bit of skepticism in that there's no absolute, universal, objective laws that humans at least can comprehend. But as the sciences have developed farther, the notion has gained ground that most, perhaps all, of our laws are only approximations. Oh, so pragmatism is just subjectivism, huh? Is that what we're doing? Believing in apple fairies and Well, wait. There's more to go. Yes, James is against this correspondence theory of truth, where truth is what corresponds to reality. But that doesn't mean subjectivity gone wild. James is going to see truth as a mediator. The individual has a stock of old opinions already, but he meets a new experience that puts them to a strain. Somebody contradicts them. Or in a reflective moment, he discovers that they contradict each other. Or he hears of facts with which they are incompatible, or desires arise in him which they cease to satisfy. So this is pretty straightforward, right? You all already have your own opinions, and these opinions are probably well thought out and based on facts. But how did you get to the opinions you now hold? By coming into contact with new facts, then harmonizing these new facts with your old opinions. That's what truth is to James, a harmonization between all of our old opinions and the new facts that we come into contact with in the world. Some new idea mediates between the stock and the new experience, and runs them into one another most felicitously and expediently. This new idea is then adopted as the true one. New truth is always a go-between, a smoother over of transitions. It marries old opinion to new fact so as ever to show a minimum of jolt, a maximum of continuity. So in philosophy, right, there's often a discussion between the objective and the subjective. But here, pragmatism is kind of like a compromise. It plays to the subjective in that there's no endpoint of truth, but it also plays to the objective in that there's new arguments, new tests, new discoveries, and new conclusions that can override our past opinions if they're incompatible. To sum it up kind of crudely, the best argument so far is the truth, but it can always be usurped by an even better argument. So going back to our apple fairy example, the scientific explanation for the white inside of the apple is going to obviously override the apple fairy hypothesis, since it's essentially a better argument. Think about arguments then on a spectrum. Although we can't reach objective truth, not all arguments are created equal, and we should hold up the best we have as truth. This theory of truth also escapes the infamous paradox of subjectivity. Essentially, the paradox is that if everything is subjective, then the statement everything is subjective as well. With pragmatism though, even if we apply the pragmatic theory of truth to itself, we could just say that pragmatism is the best theory we have so far, thus escaping the paradox. Alright, so we have our pragmatic method and our pragmatic theory of truth coming together to form pragmatism. I'm interested now to see how you might use it in both your personal affairs and in your philosophical journey. Our next video in this pragmatism series is going to cover free will because... Wait. He didn't... God damn it, he beat me to it. How am I ever going to escape being a dollar store version of Sisyphus 55? And that, my friends, is our very long video on introducing pragmatism. If you want to see some pragmatism origin videos, then check these two out. If you want to see pragmatism in action being applied to religion and other life philosophies, then check these two out. I hope I have piqued some of your interests in this philosophy. I personally think it's pretty rad myself, hence this mega video and the other 4. So if you enjoyed this video, hit the like, subscribe, and bell button. If you did not enjoy this video, then please explain why, as long as you don't mention how confusing my avatar looks. And with that, I wish you all a beautiful rest of your day.